Thank you for standing by and welcome to the AFS Best Practices webinar. Our topic today is a LIBOR update. This webinar will be approximately an hour long, and we have a variety of speakers today, and we will start with Paul Elmer, who is Managing Director here at AFSVision. Just a few reminders, we are recording today's session, and therefore this call is in listen-only mode. We do encourage questions. Please use the Q&A section to ask questions. Direct your questions to the presenter, and we'll leave some time at the end of the presentation so that we may answer as many questions as possible. You will receive an email tomorrow with a link to listen or download the presentation. Thank you for joining us today. Paul?
Thank you, Renee. Good afternoon or good morning, everybody, depending on where you are. Welcome to what I believe is our 6th LIBOR webinar update. These span back over the course of a year. We would like to, again, apologize for technical difficulties that forced us to postpone last webcast until today. We thought we might be able to resolve them and power through, but ultimately felt it was best to reschedule when we had a more stable audio so everybody could hear. As we noted at the start of last week's call, this webinar will be a little different in that there will be a few different voices that will be heard. First off, you'll notice that this isn't Dean Snyder speaking. My name is Paul Elmer, and I head up our Level 3 team. I'll kick things off here by reviewing the agenda and then turn it over to a few of the members of our LIBOR transition team. First, you will hear from Charles Wamba. For those of you who have been listening on some of the LSTA and ARRC calls, you'll recognize Charles's voice. He's been very involved in the discussions with the LSTA and working groups, and he will be providing an update of the business loan working group and some of the decisions to be made or that have been made by that group. Then you'll hear from Joe Orobano. Joe is the manager of our communications during this process of transitioning from LIBOR, and he'll provide a look at the results of the AFS survey that was issued to our client base. He'll review how you all responded to the questions in the survey, and it might provide an idea of collectively what banks may be looking at when it comes to moving off of LIBOR and towards SOFR. Then we'll provide an update on our development efforts for the changes to Level 3 and Vision that we're anticipating to support SOFR, particularly in regards to the compounding conventions. Lena Gupta, myself, will provide a review of our respective approaches. Lena from Vision and myself from Level 3. This kind of includes what fields, screens, processes, et cetera, that we're looking at impacting. And then finally, the next steps and key dates we are looking at for providing the changes. Since you probably already received the slide deck with the notice of the reschedule of webinar, I'm sure you probably looked at how this story ends as it regards to the delivering of the changes. So you'll probably already have an idea of what we're looking to do here. So if there is, as Renee mentioned, if there's any questions along the way, please submit them and we'll do our best to get to them at the end of the presentation. So with that all being said, I'd like to turn this over to Charles, and he can provide the first update on the business loans working group.
Thank you, Paul. Hello, everyone. My name is Charles Wamba, and I'm on the capital markets syndication team here at AFS. And as you already know, we've been working closely with the ARRC team on the loan working groups to do an inventory of what will be changing when we do the switch over from LIBOR to SOFR. We really, at this point, we're really coming to the end piece of it, but we still have some open questions with the ARRC that they will also need to pose to the banks to get some recommendations on some of the approaches in terms of what is changing, for example, with the calculations of interest. And that seems to be the main thing that is still lagging behind. Recently, I think it was January 21st, the ARRC sent out consultation out to the banks, and that was around spread adjustments. We already know that we'll be provided with, by the Fed, they will be providing a static spread adjustment that will go along with the SOFR published rates, but the methodology of how to come up with that spread adjustment is still in review. So they sent out a consultation out to the banks. If you did not see it, we can send you the link where you can access the details of the different methodologies of approaching the spread adjustment. And you have until March the 6th to reply via email to the Fed, or rather the ARRC committee. And on a high level, what they're looking for is, in terms of the different methodology, they're looking at questions around what's the time period of the data will they be looking at. So far, what has been proposed is looking at 5-year historical LIBOR rates, getting a mean of that, and then subtracting that from the published SOFR rate, and that difference will be what will be the spread adjustment for the different tenors. And as of today, the tenors are 1 month, 3 month, and 6 month. And they don't want to really look into the overnight or the weekly LIBOR contracts, because we don't have many of them as of today. So the current focus is on 1 month, 3 month, and 6 month. Next thing that we still have open questions with the Fed is around the calculation of the compounding methodologies. What so far has been proposed is compounding based on rate and compounding based on balance. It sounds, we already know it's complicated, but recently, with their recommendation, it was earlier this week that the ARRC shared templates of the different calculations, as well as the convention strawman of the possible changes to the methodologies of the interest calculation. And one of them was around observation shift. So as you as the bankers, as you review those spreadsheets for the different calculation, I would ask you to take a focus around the observation shift rates that are being used in those spreadsheets from July 3rd, for example, through July 5th or 6th. The reason why I'm pointing to that specific area is the Fed has put commentary, which is actually questions to the banks, of the calculation of interest across a holiday. Reason being, with observation shift, we're taking weightage based on a look back of 5 days. 5 days is the current recommended look back. With that being said, Tuesday being July 3rd, for example, and July 4th is a holiday, the rate that we'll be using on that Tuesday is from 5 days back. 5 days back might actually have a weight of 1. So that means the interest that we'll calculate on July 3rd prior to a holiday is based on 1 day. What that means is July 4th, quote unquote, is lost. But you'll catch up on that day several days down the road, 5 days later, for example. So if you look at that scenario, where the problem lies is, if I was to trade on a Tuesday, if I'm a lender, if I came in on a Tuesday and sold out the next business day, to me, the way things are today, I actually held that loan for 2 days. But with observation shift, that I said we have a 5-day look back, the days that were counted was just 1. So that means I've actually lost a day of accrual with this compounded rate. At the same time, when you're looking at the Fed templates, they do not include the spread adjustment and the credit margin in their calculation. We already know that those are not going to be compounded. So what does that mean in the scenario I just gave you? That means if I came in on Tuesday, July 3rd, and I calculated my interest on the spread adjustment and the margin, then I would have 2 days of accrual, which is how we see things today. So that means on one end, I truly accrued 2 days of interest. But on the other end, based on the compounding rate with observation shift, I lost 1 day because my rate only had a weight of a day. So that's something I really would encourage everyone to look into those templates from the Fed and the ARRC. And they're awaiting, they pose those questions, if that is acceptable. So we need your responses back to the ARRC, and you can bring them up on the next bank working group meetings and or the regular Monday LSTA question and answer meeting. Next thing, the Fed also provided fallbacks. I know this conversation has been ongoing. The fallback language, there's a hardwired fallback and the amendment fallback. So as of today, what has been proposed for the hardwired is the term SOFR plus a credit spread adjustment, or SOFR compounded either in arrears or in advance plus a credit spread adjustment. And they're also thinking, but I think as of now, this has been confirmed, they will also have a SOFR simple with a credit spread adjustment. So that's the hardwired approach. From AFS perspective, we'll be able to assist with that in terms of putting an indicator for you to know in advance what loans will be coming due for repricing that would require switching over to SOFR. And you would need to also add the credit spread adjustment, and we'll also have that functionality as a separate field for you to put that static rate. The other fallback approach is the amendment process, and that's up to the banks to choose doing an overall amendment of the credit agreement, or when rates are coming due, they need to have, the agent and the borrower will have to come up with that reference rate. If they don't come up at reference rate, send it out to the investors. If the investors don't agree to it in 5 days, then you'll have to fall back to another rate, which might be prime, which is, we already know as of today is high. So they don't recommend that as much, but it's out there for everyone to review. So as of now, that's where we stand. The hardwired approach is the one that is being pushed or recommended. The amendment process might be a little bit more complex, but the ARRC is leaving it to the market participants to make those decisions. Apart from that, general information is available on the LSTA website for everyone to review. There is documents that help you understand further how life will be after LIBOR. And they've also provided the weekly Monday phone meeting at 3 p.m. And there's also details on the dial-in if you do not have them as of today. They're part of the presentation, and you can make an effort to join in case you have questions. At this point, I'll pass it on to Joe to give an update on the survey that was recently taken. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Hello, everyone. My name is Joe Urabono. As Paul mentioned, I'm the communication lead for the LIBOR transition project here at AFS. Over the next 5 minutes, I'll be sharing the AFS LIBOR survey results with you. As you might know, approximately 6 weeks ago, AFS sent the survey to the user community in order to gather information and opinions. As we are now less than 1 year from transitioning to alternative rates, we thought it would be helpful to collect some lender-centric information. The survey was designed to give AFS a better understanding of what the lenders are currently faced with and how the lenders are planning their transition. The results should also offer some insight of how each institution's strategy is comparing with the overall community. Okay, so before I dive into the details, we at AFS would like to say thank you very much for taking the time to complete the survey. The feedback is greatly appreciated. So let's take a look starting with slide 4 here and looking at the survey results with question number 1. So as this was based off of the volume of loans being transitioned, and as you can see, the amounts are quite significant. These results confirm that AFS systems are definitely processing large loan portfolios and will be assisting with the transition of all LIBOR deals. For the next question, we notice that although 40% of the loans have a high percentage of fallback language that Charles was just discussing, they have that in place. We do realize that the lower percentage choices are not negligible. So we believe there'll still be some attention required for these loans out in the market. Question 3, almost everyone here that answered will be offering SOFR. It's the lead choice, but there are some lenders that will be offering, it looks like, prime and the Fed funds rate, which is interesting. Number 4, question 4. When it comes to what type of SOFR rate is being considered, we see here that compounded in arrears is the leading choice, with the other published rates, SOFR rates, coming in at around 60%. Next slide, please. Question 5, deciding on the specific initial offering. This was interesting. 70% are undecided. And this wasn't a surprise because we know, as Charles just mentioned, that this is reflective of the ARRC's current struggle to come up with the final recommendations. So maybe after the ARRC decisions, we were just discussing this actually not that long ago. After we do have the final decisions, we might resubmit or re-ask the questions concerning compounding in arrears. For number 6, the community, when asking the community if compounded in arrear interest is to be paid with principal for unscheduled paydowns, we have 60% selecting likely and very likely. With respect to the 40% that selected unlikely, the known questions seem to be around the compounding in arrears methodology. For example, as we know, do we compound the rate or do we compound the balance? Question 7. So basically, this is off of number 6. As we can see, this leads into question 7. Making the choice to offering compounding in arrears will be presenting challenges. Almost 1/2 of the community selected undecided. Going on to number 8, pro rata is the clear winner for the preferred interest distribution. It's the majority. And there was a 9th question that was more of a free format. That final survey question was, what could AFS do to assist with your LIBOR transition? And some of the top replies were continue to host webinars, which we will. We have one scheduled probably within the next 6 weeks. Continue to participate in the ARRC working group, which AFS will continue, of course. Provide support with the transitioning and implementation to SOFR, especially with compounding methodologies, high priority that we have noted. And number 4, lastly, please speed up the release code for compounding in arrears, which we are working on. Okay, this concludes the survey results. I'll hand over now to Lena Gupta to give everyone an update on AFS development progress.
Thank you, Joe. Hello, everyone. This is Lena Gupta, and I will be presenting high-level update on some of the changes that we are implementing in AFSVision to meet these SOFR requirements, as it has been recommended by Fed, ARRC, LSTA working group so far. So the current slide that you see is summarizing these key enhancements that we are bringing in both AFS Level 3 and AFS Vision. As we are making these changes, we are focusing to make them as a configuration or as a parameter for system to be flexible enough to meet all credit agreement needs. Data such as look-back days, supporting both requirements with and without observation shift that Charles was explaining earlier, and additional margin as spread adjustment that may be needed during the transition period from LIBOR to SOFR on existing credit agreements. We are adding them as new fields in AFSVision for user to input the data or make a selection from the modified valid values list. We will continue to support simple interest requirements on simple SOFR and make enhancements for compounding the rate for SOFR compounding average in arrears. The components that are needed to compute the compounded rate will be system calculated as per the formula that is published by the Fed, and it will be available in the UI for viewing purposes and also for extraction in an Excel or a PDF format. I have some screenshots to demonstrate these changes that are being made in AFSVision to support the SOFR requirements. But before that, I would like to request my colleague Paul Elmer to walk us through some changes that we are making in Level 3 for SOFR.
Thanks, Lena. As we previously mentioned, there are the 4 conventions that we're looking at as it relates to SOFR. And we feel that the daily simple SOFR, compounding in advance, and the forward-looking term conventions would function much like LIBOR or other indexes do today. We've provided back at the end of last year a user guide that outlines some of the approaches to these 3 conventions that show how you can handle these within your current version of Level 3 or Vision. So hopefully you've had some opportunity to review those and take a look at how that might help you with those other 3 conventions. The compounding rate and compounding balance conventions, however, are the ones that will require fairly significant changes to Level 3 and Vision. We have been kind of hoping for some additional clarity from the ARRC and the market on how these conventions would to function, but we have proceeded with our analysis and development on the compounding functionality based on what we know today. So that being said, from a Level 3 perspective, we do look to leverage as much as possible existing fields and architecture to support the compounding methodology. Given where Level 3 is in its life cycle, we felt that this was one approach that we want to take. So with compounding the rate convention, we'll talk about that first. We intend to use information on the prime schedule to support the calculations. We've got a few fields highlighted here on this particular screenshot of the 1360 prime schedule create transaction. We're going to look at using a new adjustable rate type code value on a prime schedule to direct processing to say, hey, compound the rate. Simply put, it's just an indicator, a new value in the adjustable rate type code that says utilize compounding the rate. Loans using the compounding rate should be established with a prime schedule day code that reflects a daily change. So a 1 and a second digit for those of you that are familiar with that. Even if the published rate, SOFR rate itself does not change on a given day, which is probably unlikely, the compounding calculation will still result in a change to the rate on the loan, and therefore the day code should be reflective of that changing rate. And we'll add some edits to ensure that the rate type code indicating compounding will have a day code indicating daily. The prime schedule variable number of months field will we're going to use that to denote any look-back days. So if you want to utilize the look-back days or methodology where you would pull a rate for today's accrual from, say, like 5 days ago, you would specify that number in this particular field. If you use look-back days, then you would have the published rate information at the time you are billing, and therefore gives you the opportunity to project the interest due between the bill date and the due date and have that reflected on the current bill. The flip side, of course, is that you would be accruing on a rate from 5 days ago, and then you introduce the complexities of the observation shift if that's the route that is recommended. And Charles got into a few of those details at the outset of this webinar. The published spread adjustment for SOFR rate, we're going to store in one of the two margin percent fields if they're both available on the prime schedule. The Fed will publish the spread adjustment at the time of the LIBOR cessation. And of course, that's designed to align the SOFR rate to the LIBOR rates for those loans that are still tied to LIBOR at LIBOR cessation. And as Charles mentioned, that spread adjustment is static for a given tenor. So there'll be one published for 30, one for 60, 90, et cetera. So once it's published, it will remain as is going forward. And once established in the margin fields, it would not need to change. If you do have a situation where the two margin percent fields are in use on a given loan, and the loan does specify or span the transition period, meaning it's still tied to LIBOR at LIBOR cessation, and therefore may need a spread adjustment, then we suggest maybe the spread adjustment or margins can be established on a second interest charge code. Typically, both margin percent fields are not used, but there are circumstances where you may add a percent and then say multiply by some factor. If you then further have to add a published spread adjustment, we would suggest setting that up as a different charge code to accommodate the three factors, the two margins plus the spread adjustment. Another option with that is, of course, is that the spread adjustment could be set up as a rate index, and a prime schedule for, say, charge code 101 could be tied to that index with the two associated margins in the margin percent fields. We would anticipate this probably being a potentially small subset of loans that require this and would really be a temporary condition until the loan fully moves to SOFR and no longer requires the spread adjustment. There's also been mention of the concept of a transition period for the LIBOR spread adjustment, where the whole published spread adjustment itself is not applied to a particular loan on day one of SOFR, but it's kind of phased in or over a period of, say, a year, where each month you gradually increase the percentage of the spread adjustment applied to the loan until it equals the total published adjustment. This would be up for the banks to decide if they want to use this approach, but if they do, setting the spread adjustment itself up as its own rate index and periodically updating that index could be an option that you might want to explore. But the point there, again, is we would look to leverage these fields in lieu of adding new ones and altering the architecture and all that entails in level 3. Once we calculate the rate, the compounded rate, then we would use our existing accrual routines and I'll say simple interest methodology to calculate the day's accrual. So that's taking that compounded rate times the balance and the basis and the number of days. What I don't have up here, though, is the accrue to date on the interest charge code will be used as like the compounding reset date. So the rate will compound throughout the period from the previous accrue to date to the current accrue to date. And then once we hit the current accrue to date, the rate will reset, meaning that the rate to accrue on that day will be the published SOFR rate only, not compounded. Then the next day compounding on that rate will begin and the cycle will repeat again until the next accrue to date. So that's how you get away from the compounding rate just compounding through the life of the loan, which is something you really don't want to do. And then we'll show a few pictures here later of the bills are going to be modified to show margins and spread adjustments and the published SOFR rate. We do anticipate at this time adding one new behind the scenes field on the interest header to track the first accrued to date for the charge. This is something that we need. It's not going to be an enterable field or anything, but it's potentially needed for the calculations when you start getting into backdated scenarios and so forth. So just to alert you that there is one new field. It is behind the scenes. It's not enterable, but we will need to add that. And of course, if you're using our relational download, we'll modify to include that field. Okay, and then when you're good. You can go back one. Yep. So that's the approach we're taking for compounding the rate. And then when we talk about compounding the balance, this is where we may need to add a new field to the accrual schedule to direct the use of compounding the balance. So we're examining right now, we just recently came up about the possibility of not having to add a new field and to leverage an existing one, in particular the balance type code. And, because ideally we don't want to have to add a new field, particularly when you have to add something that is an input field. That means that there's more far-reaching impacts to front ends and data entry and all those kinds of things. So we're doing some analysis, and hopefully we'll be able to determine if using the balance type is a viable option in the near future. Again, we want to try to minimize as much as we can the impacts to front end systems, et cetera, that feed into level 3. A note that where compounding the rate methodology is complicated in the sense of how the rate is calculated itself and all that. From a systems perspective, it's a little more contained in the areas of code that's hit. And once we get that rate calculated, we can kind of let the system do more or less what it does today in terms of accruing using existing routines, et cetera. Compounding the balance, however, does become a little more invasive, or a lot more invasive, to the accrual process, and will necessitate a new accrual routine to arrive at the compounding balance on which we need to accrue on any given day. So what all that means is that's going to have a far more reaching impact in terms of, technically, in terms of the areas of the code that we're going to impact. So we'll be having to deal with the daily accruals, the payoffs, the billing transaction processing, et cetera. So it does hit more areas of the system than arriving at a compounded rate. And again, like with the compounding the rate, we would look to leverage the same prime schedule field variable rate number of months to house any look back days, and as well as we would use the accrue to date on the interest charge code to be the compounding reset date. So once that date is hit, we start accruing on the loan balance only on that day. We kind of reset the loan balance to be just the balance itself, not the balance plus the previously accrued interest, and then start compounding again. The margins and spread adjustments are not to be compounded, so they would need to be set up under a separate header, like for charge code 101, and then you can tie 101 to the associated spread adjustment and add in the margins. This prevents the margins and spread adjustments from becoming part of the compounding calculation. And again, relational download, if needed, that we need to add a new field, we would update that to add that new compounding indicator if necessary. Advance there. And then this gives you a picture of what we envision the bill to look like. We want to add the the two margins, and then look back days, and then the elements in red, the published SOFR rate to give a potential client using this a better idea of how to calculate their accrued interest. A few additional notes. We are going to add edits to not allow adjustable rate loans or schedule balance loans to use compounding calculations. There's some things there that just don't seem to make sense in trying to compound on those types of loans. We do want to use the tickler or user fields to store any additional information, as Lena mentioned, for fallback language, indicators, rate, etc. From a level 3 perspective, again, we want to leverage existing fields and functionality as much as we can. So, we're going to use ticklers to house any information, or would suggest you using ticklers. If you choose, you can use any available user fields or repurposed fields as you see fit. We do need to add a new calendar to establish or to house the SOFR published rate days. So generally the SOFR calendar will follow the Fed calendar when the Fed will be open, but we know and have heard that there are some exceptions, particularly Good Friday, where the Fed would be open, but they would not be publishing a SOFR rate. So that's going to necessitate us adding a new calendar, and it would be updated and look just like any other calendar that you have today, but it's only going to be used for the calculation of the compounding rates. So I'll say, once you establish it, you will have to maintain it and put in the SOFR rate published dates. But beyond that, it's not serving a purpose beyond supporting the calculations. And again, that would be updated similar to how you update your processing calendars today. And then outside of the compounding conventions, there was a question raised about using daily simple SOFR and how rate changes applied during the billing window. That's the time between the bill date and the due date would be reflected on billing statements. So just like today, activity that occurs within the billing window on a given loan may result in adjustments being shown on the next bill. While this certainly could and does occur today, there's a concern about it could increase the number of occurrences as more loans are tied to a daily rate change. And you would expect to see that more often, at least until forward-looking SOFR terms, which would function just like your LIBORs today, would be published and utilized. So within level 3 today, there's a few things to consider there. To minimize the adjustments, you could consider establishing the loans with a bill date and accrued to date that are equal to and a due date of, say, 5 days later. So you would bill today, accrue to today, but make it due 5 days in the future. And this would allow the loan to bill with all the rate information to date, and also provide time for the customer to receive the bill and make a payment. Secondly, if you don't want to do that, there is an option to mark the bills on the bills a reason for an adjustment. So if there's an adjustment shown on the bill, there's an indicator that you can elect to have shown that says that this adjustment was due to a rate change, a principal change, or both. So that might be something that you might want to take a look at, that you maybe add a notation to help with customers, or even internally, your customer service fielding calls as to a customer calling as to why there was an adjustment, or it can be an education to your customers that elect to use compounding conventions that hey, here's the possibility we're tied, or I'm not compounding convention, tied to a daily rate, that this is the possibility if you want to be billed today and due 5 days from now, there's a potential that you're going to see adjustments each month because the rate will be changing within those 5 days between the bill date and the due date. Hopefully that's somewhat clear. So these changes that I mentioned relative to the, and again, those last couple things I talked about are all available today in level 3. And then the other changes are certainly based on what we know today, and should we receive any additional changes or requirements, we'll evaluate them and communicate them as needed. I think that's all I had for level 3 changes at this point. Lena, do you want to take it back and talk about some vision changes?
Yes, thank you, Paul. So what Paul as Paul summarized, it was all the changes that we are making in level 3. Along with all these enhancements that we are making in AFS Vision. So I will now present some of the screen level changes we are going to make in AFS Vision. So out of the box, we do support multiple calendars. So as what Paul mentioned about adding the additional calendar, a user will still be able to create a SOFR calendar or any other calendar in AFS Vision. So some of those existing functionality is available out of the box. What I will be highlighting now is some new features for SOFR requirements that we are adding in the system on top of our existing charge header notebooks or the interest header functionality. So the slide that you are seeing right now is showing the individual components that we would need to arrive to compounding rate calculation. So elements such as what is my weight, my effective rate, that will be computed based on what the weight was, the cumulative compounded, and then annualizing the rate, and then finally adding the margins and spread adjustment to arrive to all-in rate is what you would see in this screen. So this screen, a user will be able to export in an Excel format, or with AFS Vision, we also have our real-time online reporting capabilities, which we call it as printable inquiries. So the data can also be rendered into a PDF. So whatever you see on the screen is basically what is your components of when you use a compounding method. And as I mentioned earlier, we are adding that as a parameter. If you want to compound the rate or you want to compound the balance, include observation shift or not. So based on the user selection of how you create the interest charge header, once it's created and how the system is accruing or calculating that compounding rate or compounded rate behind the scenes, you would be able to see all those elements on in this view. So the next slide, what you see is that is demonstrating the change that we are bringing on the obligation notebook, or this is at the loan level. So this is an indicator field or an identifier for fallback language. So for the banks to track if there is any fallback language on the credit agreement. So this data, what you would see, will also be added to our, what we have is a vision data extract and end of day extracts of the database. So you would be able to report from the vision data extract for your internal purposes. If you want, you're tracking if there are how many loans or what percentage of your portfolio has that fallback language, and when you're transitioning from LIBOR to SOFR. So that will be the new field on the screen. Going back to our charge header screen, on some of the fields that I mentioned was on the look back days. That is required, that how far back in the business day you need to go and get the published rate for that specific business day. So that's the new field that we are adding on the screen for a user to enter number of look back days. Spread adjustment, which is required for the transitioning from LIBOR to SOFR for those existing contracts that are still on LIBOR. So we are adding those as a new field similar to what we have as Calc tab 1 and 2 or the margins. So you will be able to select the adjustment tab as add and enter a factor of 0.25 basis points or 30, whatever is as recommends, whatever Fed recommends the percentage or the basis points for those. So that a user will be able to enter here. And as Paul was mentioning earlier on the compounding reset date, which you want the system to trigger when the date when the rate has to restart compounding again. You do not want to compound for, say, a 180-day contract or a deal. You want, there are certain periods like you reprice the loan. Similarly, you would be resetting that compounding rate. And that's the parameter that a user will be able to create here. And this will work in conjunction with the anniversary date of when you're reading the rate, when you're repricing the loan, and also when the compounding resets. So those are some additional fields that we are adding on the screen in the UI. So in addition to these screen level changes that we are making in the application in AFSVision, we are also enhancing our syndication notices. And what we have for statements is our billing XML files, so that all these data elements are correctly represented in these notices and statements, which can be sent to other member banks for your syndicated deal. Or it can also, for the borrowers to have a visibility of how the compounding rate has been computed, what are those elements, what is the look back days, what was the spread adjustment added, what was the base rate or the publish, what's your margin, and then all in. So all those data elements that I was mentioning in my slide on the charge header balance activity, we're adding all those information in our syndication notices. And these are the fields that we have on the billing XML. So we'll add all the information. So if you are rendering your statement solution or you're consuming billing XML file and sending to your own statement solution, you would be able to have all the possible data elements on what these dates are or how that information can be sent to your customers to show up in the statements. So with this information, I would again request Paul to provide some insights on what are our next steps and delivery dates for these SOFR enhancements are in both Level 3 and AFSVision.
Thank you, Lena. I'm sure that having provided this slide deck, I think last week, you probably turned to the last page here to see what we had in mind for delivery at this point. At this point, we're targeting compounding the rate. We're looking at this as two pieces. One, we start with compounding the rate, and then secondly, compounding the balance calculation will come after compounding the rate. So as you can see, we're targeting compounding the rate for Vision to be available by the end of July, with compounding of the balance functionality to be followed sometime in the third quarter of this year. From a Level 3 perspective, the rate we're looking at providing at the end of June of this year, and then compounding the balance at the end of August. And as we get closer to these target delivery dates, we'll be able to provide some more detail on the exact modules affected and potential delivery options. As we've mentioned before, that we are providing this as a patch and not a full release. We will provide, at least from a Level 3 perspective, providing support for that code until you migrate to Vision. So again, this is based on what we know today, and we have a team here working on these changes, as well as monitoring the ARRC and the LSTA and other groups as they wrestle with the complexities of these changes, and particularly when you talk about the compounding calculations. So with that, I think that concludes our prepared slides, and if we have any questions, we'll try our best to answer them.
Okay, so if you are interested in asking questions, please use the Q&A function. Give us a moment so we can look. We do have a few that we can read, and then we'll be back on to answer them. Thank you.
All right. I'll start with the question on look back. We have a question that says, will you be able to distinguish between business day and calendar day look back in the new field for the look back days? The answer is yes. When we are talking about the look back periods, we are being very specific to business days as opposed to calendar days. So in the system, we'll be able to distinguish that. The next question says, can you please post an email to the Fed link that you spoke about at the beginning of the presentation and what we need to do with it? Yes. So as a follow-up to this webinar, we'll be sending that link and also providing the dates for when you need to get back to the ARRC on the recommendations. Okay, we have another question on any insight or approaches on the end of life for LIBOR topic. As of now, we all know that LIBOR is, the FCA will no longer be compelling the panel banks in the UK to publish LIBOR rates. So with that being said, December 31st, 2021, we definitely expect LIBOR to cease. If it continues to be published, the ARRC is saying that rate will not be reliable. So basically will not be used for new contracts. You might see it, but it's, as of now, the recommendation is it will not be reliable. So that's one thing to note. And the reason being, just to expound a little bit, the reason being today we have about 16 to 20 panel banks that are currently being compelled to publish that rate. Now, with the recommendation of getting away from LIBOR, is actually to their advantage for them not to publish, because since that, since when was it, 2012, when there was the issue of manipulation of that rate, these banks were being fined. They got regulations that actually interfered with their day-to-day business, because now any rate that they are publishing out there for interbank offering, they are worried that if it's high and doesn't compare to the market trend, then someone might accuse them and then fine them. So to them, it's an incentive to them to stop publishing. So that's number one. The other thing is also the FCA has said for the UK side that new loans as of end of Q3 2020 this year, they're asking banks to actually stop creating new credit agreements based on LIBOR. So what does that mean for us? Then the approach from a vendor perspective is we have to be ready for both markets. We have to be ready to support LIBOR loans by the end of Q3 2020 to support your business. So in terms of the approach, don't wait up until late next year for you to start transitioning into SOFR. As of now, you should be looking through your credit agreements and making proposals of how to actually implement or transfer loans, existing loans into SOFR. And the recommendation from the ARRC is don't do it in the middle of the period. Actually wait until your contract comes to the end and then flip it over to SOFR. I hope that answers that question.
We actually have quite a few questions. So we are coming up to the top of the hour. And so actually, Paul's going to answer one other question, and then.
Yeah, there was a couple questions around the alternate calendar. And, one of those is that it was not highlighted in red on the prime schedule change. And that's not something, you're not going to have to indicate, use the alternate calendar, the new one for this process. It would be quote automatically used if you elect to do any of the compounding. So it's not something that you're going to select. We needed to add it to support the calculations only. So it's really not an option per se. And that alternate calendar is something that would be delivered as part of the compounding the rate delivery, and it would be needed for compounding the balance as well, but it'll be there once we get the compounding the rate delivery.
Okay, we'd like to thank you all for attending today. As I said, with us coming to the top of the hour, we do have a few other questions. We will compile all of the questions that we received today. We will answer them and then email those out to everyone that attended the webinar. So we thank you for your time today and have a good day.